Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. In this week's episode, we're joined by Mark Rappolt, editor of the international contemporary art magazine, Art Review. Each year, Art Review does a Power 100 ranking where they rank the most influential people in art. It's always fun having Mark on the podcast to help break down their list and explain their rationale behind some of their selections. They just came out with their rankings for this year, and Mark was kind enough to join us to chat about it. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks so much for listening. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course. It's always fun having you on the podcast to help reveal and dissect some of the names on your Power 100 list. But before we even do that, I think it'd be great to take a step back, and if you could just tell us a little bit about the history of this list. How long have you been doing it at Art Review? What exactly are you ranking, and who ranks them?
So the list itself has been going for 21 years. This is the 21st edition. Originally, it was founded to do a kind of job that we don't do as art critics. Normally, with art critics, we talk about what's put before us. And I think Art Review become very interested in the network of influences that cause something to, say, be shown at MoMA or at Tate or at the Pompidou, and that this wasn't just a case as one might think about it in a common sense way, that this was the best artists around. It was actually the product of a network of vested interests, whether that be collectors, gallerists, supporters and backers of other kinds, or anything else. So the list was really set up to sort of track that network of interests and to look at how it was influencing the art we got to see. And I think for the list itself, we have three basic criteria. The first is that the people on the list actually have to have done something in the past year. That they have to have an influence that's not just local, but is also international. Although I guess we can see to some extent that all influence starts on a local basis. And lastly, and perhaps more importantly, they have to influence the kind of work that's being made today. And so we have a panel of around 40 people from around the world, each looking at who's influencing the art that's being made where they are from their perspective. And they send a list of recommendations through, and then we get together and duke it out to see whether, for instance, the most powerful person in the US is as powerful as the powerful person in India or New Delhi or somewhere like that. So maybe that's where the sort of really subjective stuff comes into, is sort of trying to merge these different geographies, because the truth really is that power can look entirely different depending on where you're looking at it from.
And so if we jump into the list, if I recall correctly, last year at the top of your list actually wasn't a person, but more the concept of NFTs, which I think was really fascinating. So tell us, who is at the top of your ranking this year and why?
So the top of this year's ranking is a Indonesian collective called Ruangrupa. It was founded originally by artists in 2000. They're not necessarily going to be a name or a concept that's super familiar to everyone outside the art world. But they curated Documenta this year, which is possibly the world's most important contemporary art show, which happens every 5 years in Kassel in Germany. And I think they top the list really because they introduced a new way of looking at what an exhibition is, what curating is, and to some degree what art is. Their exhibition was very much in the mold of a kind of social network. So they invited other collectives who then invited other collectives or other people they were aligned and worked with in an exhibition that in the end had 1,500 participants in it. And at the same time, I guess they're not an uncontroversial number one, because as is the case with many social networks, there were controversies surrounding instances, in this case, of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic imagery that came about, I think, partly as a result of this very horizontal way of working. So it's very much a move away from what the power list itself is in a way. So it's not about a top-down hierarchy, a curator having a vision and then enacting the vision through the works of artists. It was very much a spreading out of responsibility horizontally, and definitely a new way of thinking about these things. And I think it's also interesting because it's really one of the first times in a while that a sort of properly disruptive force that imagines the art world in a different way has occupied the top spot.
And you also mentioned that you have panelists or individuals who are providing their input on these rankings from all over the world to provide different perspectives based on their geographies. So I'm curious, tell me about the geographical diversity of the overall rankings. Are we seeing influence occurring from throughout the world? We always talk about the world becoming a smaller place. Or is influence concentrated heavily in really the major art world hubs?
I think it's certainly spreading out from what began as a very European-American ranking. I mean, to say now it's Asia probably has almost as many people on the list as do those two continents. But at the same time, it's definitely not global in a sense that Africa has relatively few representatives, as does South America. So yes and no in a way. And I think that's kind of realistic. I think also there are places in the world where the kind of art world or art system as we know it isn't particularly embedded. That might be in the case of, say, artists working with galleries. In some places, it's more a consignment basis where they're not really represented by the galleries, but they do shows with galleries. And I think those models don't extend all over the world. So I think we're seeing a kind of pushback in a way of other models, other ways of doing things.
And who are some new entrants who maybe haven't cracked the list in the past, but finally have done so this year that you think are noteworthy?
I think at number 3, we have, I guess, another concept, as you mentioned with NFTs last year, which is unionization and unions. And I think throughout the US and Europe and places beyond, we're seeing these ideas of recognizing larger networks involved with art, larger types of work involved with art, and the coming together of those kind of professionals to seek recognition, whether it's financial or in terms of job security or in terms of just plain being acknowledged within the art world as a whole. And I guess that links partly to what I was talking about with the number 1. But we've seen that kind of breaking out all over the space. And whether that is expressed through striking or protesting depends on different situations. So I think that's probably the most significant new entry. And then I think Sonia Boyce, for example, who did the British Pavilion at Venice and jointly won a Golden Lion, is new. And I think also Isaac Julian. So I think there's sort of a legacy of reflecting on the history of overlooked cultures and ethnicities within the art world that continues to be reflected on the list.
And I'm sure many of our listeners and just in general art world participants are very familiar with most of the galleries around the world. Who are some of the galleries that made this year's list?
Yes, I think still, I mean, in the pandemic, there were a lot less galleries on the list for obvious reasons because they were kind of shuttered by and large. And we haven't seen a massive haul of galleries coming back onto the list. I think the ones that are there, people like David Swerner, probably do more than what we conventionally think of as running a shop that sells art. So I think Swerner's obviously got platform and other kind of digital spaces and physical spaces that take a more generous look at what being a gallery is. I think other galleries on the list, such as House and Worth, or it goes into a degree, are on the edge of becoming lifestyle brands. So they're not just a gallery. There's a sort of bigger concept of what it is to live with art that's being promoted through them. So I think the galleries that are on the list are largely galleries that do a bit more than what the man on the street might think a gallery is supposed to do.
And of course, your rankings are about influence in the art world. So if we take a look at the different types of positions or roles within the art world, are there some that you saw occur regularly on this list? And maybe are there some that didn't appear as often as they had in years past? I guess what I'm trying to get at is what areas or positions within the art world have more influence this year than in years past? And are there certain types of positions that don't nearly have as much influence as they have in previous years?
That's an interesting question. I think, artists, there are more artists on the list than there were previously. And I think there's definitely a move since the pandemic for a focus on people actually doing things after a time in which people can do a lot. And at the same time, I think a lot of these roles, as I mentioned, with gallerists, are being sort of rethought. So curators have a different relationship to broader questions of social care. And I think art in general is trying to find ways of linking up with, let's call it real life, a bit more closely. So I think that applies to the kind of museum directors on the list, certainly to the collectors as well. We see a lot more activist collectors who have agendas that they want to push rather than just plain old innocent philanthropy. Not that there necessarily was ever such a thing. But I think it's the kind of balance between them all. We've had also David Adjaye's on the list this year. So an architect, which is unusual, but I think what he does is very much linked closely to particular types of programming. So he doesn't just build envelopes in which art is housed, but he also builds structures that shape programs in different ways. So I think it's very much about these sort of changing moment of these roles and how they relate to the real world and the art world.
Mark, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and helping us break down this year's Art Review Power 100 list. We always enjoy having you on. If our listeners want to check out the list, if they haven't already, where can they find it?
You can find it all on artreview.com or by going through artreview.com to subscribe to the magazine that way.
Thanks so much again, Mark.
Great. Thanks a lot, Adam.